This evening we're welcoming another star, Sylvia Yount from the Metropolitan. And at the Metropolitan in New York, Sylvia's official title is a mouthful. She is the Lawrence Fleischman Curator in Charge of the American Wing, a position that she's held for roughly a year and a half. And essentially, she is the mastermind for American art in the building and also that physical acreage that is the American Wing. There are 10 curators that work with her and 25 additional staff. So it'd be interesting to see that whip that she cracks at the Metropolitan. She's been at other places across her career. I acknowledge she's just recently moved to New York into the Metropolitan. She was the chief curator at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, and she held that position for 4 years, but she went there as the curator of American art, a post that she held for 7. Before that, she was at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta for 6 years, and she was the curator of American art there. She and I intersected, as you see, long enough ago when she was at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and she was chief curator there. And Pennsylvania Academy, that's going to ring a bell for a couple of people in the room, because Jody Throckmorton, who had been, beloved curator, who had been at the Ulrich, is now at the Pennsylvania Academy. And Sylvia started her career at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Sylvia is a solid, grounded 19th century scholar and curator, well-published, organized landmark touring exhibitions on such artists as Maxfield Parrish and Cecilia Beau. And as well as done a really fascinating project on emerging American modernism. She's had projects and publications on such diverse American artists as Mary Cassatt, George Caleb Bingham, Winslow Homer. She did her thesis on the Ashcan artist Edward Shinn, and written on Edward Hopper as well. We invited her for a unique talk, given her career, thinking about innovation and knowing that many of us might have a sense of the Metropolitan New York as really the dignified establishment museum, and it has lived out that reputation across the decades, but not recently. They are embracing change in absolutely incredible ways, and I wanted someone from the museum to be able to come and describe some of that. Relatively new director, although Sylvia let me know Tom Campbell took the reins 7 years ago, so I guess not so new. But still, redirecting the ocean liner nonetheless, and looking for creative ways to take a historical rooted museum and generate deep relevance for audiences today. They have a media lab in a department that they call the Creative Development Group. They have a digital underground blog, and the Metropolitan has an app. I'm going to stop right there because I might be stealing some of her thunder. Please help me to welcome Sylvia Yount to Wichita.
Thank you so much, Patricia. It's an honor, privilege to speak to the venerable Murdock Society and to visit the Wichita Art Museum for my first time. Had a lovely tour of the town today with Patricia. I've long admired your American art collection, which I've known from your generous loans to various exhibitions, of course, especially these, let me start with images. You don't want to look at my name anymore. Especially these 2 iconic works from your collection by Mary Cassatt and Robert Henry, and the opportunity to experience your museum in person, of course, as well as to reconnect with a longtime colleague. Your dynamic director, Patricia McDonnell, made her gracious invitation very enticing. And I understand that the theme of your programming this year is, as Patricia said, maybe reinvention and innovation in the museum field. So I'm very privileged to speak to you a little bit about what's going on in this regard at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, specifically in the American Wing, of which I became the head, as Patricia said, in September of 2014. It's a genuine honor to succeed the esteemed scholar of colonial furniture, Morrison Heckscher, arriving at such a transformative time in the Met's history. And here I'm showing you an image of Maury and his crew in 2011, this playful image marking the conservation of the epic famed Emanuel Leutze Washington crossing the Delaware, and also marking the completion of the 2011 renovation of the American Wing and a reinstallation of the collection. This was only the third renovation of the wing in its history. So fast forward about 5 years, and the American Wing's curatorial staff, as Patricia mentioned, now consists of 10 curators. We've restored the balance between fine arts and decorative arts curators. So we have 5 who specialize in painting, sculpture, works on paper, and 5 who specialize in the decorative arts, furniture, textiles, silver, metalwork, and ceramics and glass. And again, this represents a return to what had been a little bit of an imbalance in the decorative arts direction for a while. The American Wing is one of 17, it's one of the largest actually of the Met's 17 curatorial departments, and it's the only Western collecting area at the institution that does show this range of media, so both the fine arts and the decorative arts, giving us great depth and breadth, of course, in our holdings of some roughly 20,000 objects. Now is a particularly exciting time to be at the Met as it undergoes significant change and growth from last month's opening of Met Breuer as a showcase for modern and contemporary art, sometimes keyed to our historical past. For example, in this opening century-sweeping survey exhibition entitled Unfinished, Thoughts Left Visible, to many developments across the institution in staffing, programming, and of course planning for the future. Some you may recognize, this used to be known as the Whitney. We are now leasing this fabulous Marcel Breuer building for 8 years. We have an 8-year lease, and the Whitney, of course, has reinvented itself in a spectacular new space down in the meatpacking district designed by Renzo Piano. So in fact, the museum, I was mentioning this to someone at lunch, has approved its first formal strategic plan in just over a year ago, and this is actually the first one in its 146-year history. So it's kind of a big deal for the Met, an important document that certainly also includes a new mission and a new vision statement. Our forward-thinking director, Tom Campbell's goal to make the Met a more welcoming, accessible, transparent, and relevant place, as Patricia mentioned, that really continues to believe in the power of art and ideas to engage broader audiences, is a very consequential shared mandate now at the museum, not just for the staff, but for our donor base and board as well. Of course, while we're looking ahead to the future, we're also sensitive to the importance of historical foundations and legacies that have shaped the institution over its 146-year history. And I'm showing you a slide at the top left of our first building in Central Park, the 1880 Ruskinian Gothic design by Calvert Vaux, also a very important designer of Central Park, and Jacob Ray Mould, that Edith Wharton referred to in her great New York novel, The Age of Innocence, as mouldered in unvisited loneliness. And in fact, it was. No one went to this museum in the 1880s. Now, founding Met trustee and architect Richard Morris Hunt designed the 1902 Beaux-Arts building in which we live today, with its grand entrance on Fifth Avenue, which ushered in a new era of critical reputation and visitor popularity that clearly continues to define the Met today. One of the largest and most significant art museums in the world, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, employs some 2,000 staff, draws more than 6.3 million visitors annually, and features approximately 2 million works of art across 5,000 years of world culture, filling a 4-city block building of roughly 2 million square feet. So those are the facts and figures for the night, I promise. We're also now open 7 days a week with 2 late nights, Friday and Saturday date nights, I think as Patricia was calling them, which have become actually among our most popular times to visit. It's also the less crowded times to visit. I'd encourage you, if you want to see a big show coming in the evening on a Friday or Saturday, you're much more likely to have some of the galleries to yourself. And we've also started offering a full array of public programs on these late nights. So music, dance, food, a performance, a range of things. So truly something for everyone. And as these facts certainly suggest, the Met, which is a key cultural centerpiece of an international capital with many, though, landmark institutions, the Met has little trouble drawing people to its front doors, which of course is an ongoing concern for many museums in this country, many of which where I have worked previously. However, it's only recently, I'd say, that the Met has started to take a serious look at the kind of visitor experiences that are happening inside our building, inside our galleries, as well as via our different digital platforms that are allowing us to seek ways to engage our visitors and public in more meaningful ways. And in these terms, I think it's fair to say that the Met lags behind many other American museums that have long made audience engagement a key objective. But we're currently trying to make up for lost time, and I'm showing you just some of those venues or vehicles. Our much maligned new logo. If you read the New York Times, there was a lot of ink spilled about this new logo. Nothing else going on in the news that week, I guess. But it is part of a larger rebranding effort, which is really grounded in more audience-focused issues that coincided with the opening of the Met Breuer last month. March 1st, everything changed. It was like the Foucaultian panopticon. It all changed. Turned on our computers. It was all different. We also have a Met app, as Patricia mentioned, which is mostly useful if you're coming to the museum and want to know what's on, not really something you use when you're in the galleries. So we're addressing that. And then also I'm showing you a promotional flyer for one of our very successful Teens Take the Met programs, which were inaugurated by our fairly new head of education, Sandra Jackson Dumas, who came to us from the Seattle Art Museum, where she had great success with these programs last year. She arrived at the Met just a little bit before I did. So indeed, the Met today is not your parents' museum, having become a lot more experimental, interdisciplinary, and cross-cultural in its focus, while still very much invested in producing these grand historical narratives as well as spectacle. One critic has called us a history writing and editing machine. The museum is less a dusty repository for works of art of the past than a place of so-called living culture, where aesthetic experiences can be found not only in our extensive galleries, but in our performance spaces and also on our website. And for example, I'm going to show you two clips right now, so you don't have to listen to me for a few minutes. One is actually from our very popular Artist Project web series, which debuted about a year ago, where I think we're into the 6th season now. And this is a series in which contemporary artists were invited to reflect on sources of inspiration in the museum's collection. They have to come to the museum, they can't phone it in. And instead of doing videos of them, our photographer and producers did some very beautiful still photographs that you'll see are artfully edited together. And the one I'm going to show you features the Brazilian-born, New York-based mixed media installation artist Vik Muniz, and his very extraordinarily, I think, brilliant response to the open storage area of our Henry Luce Center for the Study of American Art. If you've been to the Met on that mezzanine level, you walk into a space that has a lot of glass cases. It's our open storage area. The collection, it's not all of our collections that's not on view in the galleries, but it's a good chunk of it. So I'll play that for you now.
My name is Vik Muniz, and I'm a visual artist. I remember finding this place completely by chance. My first impression was that the entire place was some kind of weird contemporary art installation. I actually asked the guard. He said, no, this is a storage that was all made visible, so the objects are constantly on view. Now, the Luce Center is a place that I always visit every time I come to the museum, because it always gives me ideas, because the connections between one object and another are very loose. And they are not preconceived. It's like you're in the vegetable market, you haven't cooked them yet. You have perfume flasks and then Tiffany lamps and decorative paintings and sculptures, grandfather clocks and doorknobs, paperweights. It's a wealth of stimuli. There's an area of the Luce Center filled with frames, which I think is a great metaphor for the museum as a whole. The museum itself is a huge frame, it's a huge pedestal. You choose to put things in it. Outside the Luce Center, the museum creates an idea of quality. What's a high-quality object? What's an object that represents a certain point in history? When you see one thing by itself, separated from a class of things, all of a sudden that becomes a masterpiece, something very precious, very important. Perhaps because I come from Brazil and I grew up during a military dictatorship, I became very allergic to propaganda or any structured kind of information to come my way. In the Luz Center, this sheer accumulation of objects and their casual taxonomy makes it like a semantic maze. You're trying to find meaning in these things that are not really leading you anyway. They're not asking any questions. They just are. You have to look without prejudice. It leaves up to you to make your own narrative, to create your own story. You're not just looking at something because somebody told you it's good. You have to figure out how to find your way around a place where you have access to everything at once. It's like the internet, but it's material. You feel its physical presence. I normally say that art is only alive when there's somebody in front of it. So it's a beautiful idea. The thought that you have a great percentage of the collection in the Luz Center makes you think more. You meditate upon the idea that most of the information that gets to you one way or another is being somehow manipulated, somehow crafted, and it is in a certain way biased. The Luz Center is transgressive in that you're being empowered. It makes you think about the mechanisms of this place, how things get shown and how things do not get shown. And it's quite refreshing. It's like the anti-museum.
The anti-museum. I love that. You can imagine how much we love this in the American wing. Most of the artists are choosing singular objects, so he was one of the first to actually choose a site in the museum, a space, to talk about it in much more metaphoric terms, so that was really terrific. How many of you have been to the Luz Center? Have you been through that? Many of you? And they do exist in a few other institutions. The Luz Foundation, coming from Henry Luce, Time Magazine, at a certain point in the 1980s, the Met's was the first one to open, I think in like 87 or 88. And then they also funded one at the Brooklyn Museum, at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, as well as the New York Historical Society. They will not be funding them any longer. But in fact, this center at the Met was the first space for really a computerized cataloging of the collection. We didn't have a database system, if you can believe it, at the Met in the late 80s, and we pioneered it in the Luz Center. So a lot of interesting things came from this experiment, and it continues to be one of the most popular spaces in the wing today. The Met also has a fairly new artist in residence program that comes out of our Department of Concerts and Lectures, which is now called Met Live Arts. And last year we hosted the Civilians, a New York-based investigative theatrical troupe, which produced a special program on the American wing that explored issues of art, identity, and cultural nationalism by interviewing staff as well as visitors in the galleries, just coming up to people and asking them certain questions about what they were seeing in the wing. And then they dramatize these words, and you give them your permission if you agree to talk to them, in a performance that also includes music, original music. For example, this rather amazing rap about one of our icons, John Singer Sargent's Madam X, that I wanted to play for you. Here's a photograph of some of the performances, just still photographs. And then here is, give you a little taste of it.
The John Singer Sargent paintings and sit there and meditate. I'm obsessed with Madam X. I'm obsessed with Madam X. I'm obsessed with Madam X. It's sexy to be stuck in such a confident pose. Sargent was this famous young genius painter. This one year he debuted this painting, and like the strap was down, the one on the left was down to her whatever, because this woman was like a really kind of grand dammy Kim Kardashian of her time. It's sexy to be striking such a comfortable. Anyway, everyone looked at it and was like horrified because it just kind of spoke to how the social degradation of Paris at the time. Everyone was going through a gross like Moulin Rouge. Yeah, everyone was going through a gross like Moulin Rouge. Yeah, everyone was going through. Yeah. Everyone was going through a gross like Moulin Rouge. Yeah, everyone was going through a gross like Moulin Rouge. Yeah, everyone was going through. Yeah. So he had to take it down and then repaint the strap. But she's so elegant, it's sexy to be. It's sexy to be striking such a comfortable.
There we go. A little performance for you. Yeah, they only did this. They did it one weekend, so it was a Friday and Saturday night, and it was just extraordinary. And I had just arrived right when they were starting the process of doing the interviews, and we learned so much about what kind of conversations were going on at our galleries. It was really fascinating for the curators. A little scary for some of the curators, but it was great. It was a great experience. But in light of kind of these broader institutional initiatives and context and the will to become a more dynamic institution, when it comes to the American Wing, a department founded in 1924 with a focus on historical interiors or period rooms and Americana, I feel that we have a very unique opportunity to tell more expanded stories of American art, life, and identity, both through our strong, mature holdings as well as through new acquisitions that really help us bridge the gaps in our collections with work of equal quality and significance. For example, this circa 1890 oil by Charles Ethan Porter, who was the only 19th century African-American artist to specialize in still lifes and one of the first to exhibit his work nationally. Porter studied in New York and Paris. He was from Connecticut originally, and painted this work at a time when the watermelon, an earlier symbol of American abundance, and during the Civil War period, one particularly associated with free blacks, was being recast in popular terms as a symbol of virulent stereotyping. So I find it so interesting that Porter returns from Paris, reclaims this American subject, which had been painted in many of the early still lifes by the Peel family and many folk paintings, and adds this kind of French stylistic flavor a la Fantin-Latour, Edouard Monet, and he's kind of challenging this contemporary racist trope. And after decades of success, painting similar pictures of fruit and flowers with the support of patrons like Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, of course, and also the landscape painter Frederick Edwin Church, both Connecticut natives, or Connecticut residents, not natives. Porter died in poverty and obscurity, and in fact, a resurgence of interest in his work didn't really date till the late 1980s. So it's a great lesson, I think, for many of us who study American art, that we have a certain canon that we've inherited, but we're always looking for those artists who didn't, have the attention that maybe they did in their lifetime, but certainly they didn't. They don't retain the same profile today. I had previously purchased a Porter smaller still life for the VMFA, for the Virginia Museum, and this was the first of many acquisitions I've made of objects by African American artists since coming to the Met. The most recent being this rather entrancing or disquieting, depending on your taste, portrait of a Baltimore toddler going on 40 here by the first, the wisdom of ages in her eyes. It's just amazing. But this is actually by the first known professional African-American artist to work in this country, an artist by the name of Joshua Johnson. The painting itself, this portrait of Emma Von Naim, is widely regarded as an icon of American folk painting, and in fact, it wasn't until the 1980s that it was even known to be by an African-American artist. It also reveals the American Wing's commitment to strengthening our folk art holdings. In fact, most of our folk art came from the collection of the Garbishes. You might have heard of Edgar and William Garbish, major collectors of folk art in the 1950s and 60s, who ended up giving a lot of their collection to museums around the country, the largest of which went to the National Gallery in Washington. They actually gave this painting to the Whitney Museum, where they were involved. And the Whitney deaccessioned it in the late 1980s when they sold off all of their 19th century paintings to focus on 20th and 21st century art. contemporary art. So, and then it went into a private collection in Detroit, and we were just able to acquire it just a few months ago. In addition to the Johnson and Porter oils, we've also been able to acquire this kind of lovely autumnal watercolor, also by Charles Ethan Porter, as well as a rare French landscape by William Harper, who studied in both Chicago and Paris, and was one of the few African-American pupils of Henry Ossawa Tanner, the much better known expatriate painter who was based in Paris. And all of these works have expanded our very small holdings of 19th and early 20th century artists of color to great effect. And I think it's really this strategic attention to shaping the collection, to growing the collection, so we can tell these more inclusive American stories that will allow the Met to kind of pursue this goal of becoming one of the most inspiring art museums in the world. And in fact, I really believe that in order to maintain our leadership position as an encyclopedic museum, that we really need to embrace this goal and do a better job of really defining what we mean by American, first of all, the American wing, and you know what that claim suggests. I've long been committed to rethinking the so-called art historical canon by developing American collections and exhibitions that feature a wider range of artists and works, both transformative and textural, something that I've pursued in my previous institutions. Interestingly, the museum world seems to be going through a real zeitgeist of sorts, with a much more self-conscious attention to this, to being paid to artists who've been left out of the canonic collections. For example, the Whitney, since their move to the Meatpacking District in their opening exhibition called America is Hard to See, maybe some of you saw it, they received a great deal of praise, well-deserved praise, for their efforts in this regard, pulling things out of their vaults that hasn't been seen in years by Asian American artists, African American artists, women artists, and the Museum of Modern Art has also taken a much more focused approach to this and thinking really strategically about how they can broaden their collection and tell more inclusive stories. And these are just some of the projects, Patricia mentioned a few of them that I've been involved in, the Maxfield Parrish Show, and an exhibition looking at a broader array of American modernists, both done at the Pennsylvania Academy, as well as an exhibition of Cecilia Bowe's work, begun in Philadelphia and realized in Atlanta at the High, and then as well as some acquisitions that I made for the Virginia Museum by women and artists of color, including Marguerite Zorak. And I saw a lovely drawing by Marguerite Zorak in your show that Lisa did earlier today, as well as Jacob Lawrence. And under my leadership, curators in the American wing are similarly doing more to address notable gaps in our collection through strong acquisitions of underrepresented artists. For example, this lovely pair of kind of cabinet-sized marble busts by the mixed-race sculptor Edmonia Lewis. Colonial Latin American art, namely the spectacular votive object, the Crown of the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception, known as the Crown of the Andes. It's among the most important examples of Goldsmith's work from colonial Spanish America. It's a 17th to 18th century repoussé and chased gold crown with 443 pure emeralds from the mines of Colombia that was made to adorn a statue of the Virgin Mary in the Cathedral of Popayan in New Granada, now Colombia. And this is a recently acquired work that is an anchor of a new collection area at the Met that's being developed by the American Wing's first ever colonial Latin American specialist, a brilliant woman by the name of Rhonda Cassell, who actually had been the curator of paintings at the Indianapolis Museum and then came to do a fellowship at the Met. And our director kind of picked her out of the European Paintings department and thought we should really think about where we can tell the story of colonial Latin American art. And he thought that the American Wing would be an interesting place to start. So we've all been thinking about how we can tell a broader hemispheric story about American art, given that we don't really have the collection yet to tell those stories. So Rhonda's just done a very thoughtful installation about collecting this material at the Met in our history and how we hope to grow it in the future. And then I also mentioned, in terms of the Joshua Johnson portrait, how we're very interested in acquiring significant examples of vernacular or folk art, including quilts and examples of Shenandoah pottery, such as these engaging lions by John Bell, as well as other works of greater regional diversity. The American Wing tells a very, not even 13 colony story, I'd say probably about 4 colonies. We don't have a lot of regional variation in terms of anywhere outside the Northeast, though that's starting to change. So certainly Western art, Southern material, that's all kind of a new area we're really trying to grow. And this beautiful, evocative gouache by Henry Farney, the Cincinnati-based artist. This just came into the collection just last year, as well as a much newer acquisition, this very dramatic California scene, Clear Lake, California, a scene of the Pomo Indians, a roundhouse ceremony by the French-born Jules Tavernier, who I know Lisa knows. He became the painter of San Francisco, I gather, in the 1870s and 80s. And this painting just went on view in our main epic gallery with the Leutze painting and our great Bierstadt. It's actually one of the first paintings we have of Native people on their land, so it's a very interesting piece. Brings a lot of different storylines into the gallery, certainly. At the same time, we of course continue to build strategically on collection strengths, such as this experimental squash blossom panel by Louis Comfort Tiffany from the early 1880s, and this utterly unique objet d'art by Frederick Vic Moniz, who's well represented in the collection with his larger bronzes and maybe in larger public sculptures. We're also acquiring more drawings with a particular interest in works that reveal an artist's process, including the study for John Singer Sargent's iconic Carnation Lily Lily Rose, which is a fabulous painting by Sargent that's owned by the Tate Gallery in London, and its condition is so fragile now it doesn't travel anymore, so it will never leave London again. I think some of you said you saw the Sargent show, or actually you saw the Sargent show in London, and you would have seen this painting in the Sargent show at the National Portrait Gallery. It was too fragile to travel to the Met's venue, unfortunately. But we were able to acquire this double-sided drawing at auction just a few weeks before the exhibition opened, so we were able to bring that into the exhibition. And also Elihu Vedder, this is a figural sketch for one of the Pleiades, which is a painting that we own by the artist. And Winslow Homer's first visual so-called note for what would become a decade later his masterful Gulf Stream, which is another icon in our collection. And we actually acquired this and decided in discussions with our paper conservator to leave that edge shown. So we actually just have it floating in a mat because it so much suggests just the freshness of that sketch. And this actually dated to the early 1880s on Homer's first trip to the Caribbean, and he spied this boat in peril. There are two figures, you might notice. It took him over 10 years, almost a decade later, to realize this much more kind of universal statement about man and nature and the perils, and obviously with an African-American figure, or certainly a West Indian figure, spoke greatly about the race conditions in the world and in America in the 1890s. So just a fascinating document, which we hope, normally a drawing like this would never be shown at the Met. It'd be something you'd keep in the study collection, people would come and look at it, but to have the opportunity to actually bring it into the gallery so people can think about process and the approach of the artist. So ratcheting up our collection building and instituting more regular rotations certainly allow us to keep our permanent collection galleries fresher for both regular and infrequent visitors alike. And here's just a composite glimpse of some of the American works acquired by the museum last year, many of which are now on view in our galleries and really help us to broaden these narratives. We're also re-examining the rather arcane chronological divide between the American wing and the modern and contemporary departments by pursuing more cross-departmental loans and collaborations. For example, displays of work by artists such as Rockwell Kent, Edward Hopper, and George Bellows, who technically reside in the modern and contemporary department due to their birth dates. So an American artist who was born before 1876 now falls to the American wing, after 1876 to the modern and contemporary wing. So a rather odd way to think about, that taxonomy, and we're hoping to complicate that as we move forward. And but in the meantime, it's great to be able to have loans to the galleries. Technically, the wing's parameters date from the late 17th century, or mid 17th century, to the early 20th century. And I couldn't resist sharing this slide of a wall in our Civil War gallery, which features, yes, here, good old John Brown, which features two very different representations, of course, of the radical abolitionist, John Stuart Curry's firebrand of Osawatomie, and I am pronouncing that right? It's Osawatomie, not Osawatomie. Thank you. A Kansan friend told me that. This and the larger-than-life 1939 sketch, he actually called it a sketch, that you'll recognize, of course, from the artist mural cycle in Topeka, alongside Thomas Hovenden's much more subdued Martyr on the way to his death in Virginia, now West Virginia, a work painted in the early 1880s. And this display, I have to say, has proven to be one of the most popular and unexpected juxtapositions of 19th and 20th century works in our galleries. And you actually enter the gallery over here from the right, and people always do a double take. It's wonderful to watch people really have to think a minute where they are in the scope of the museum, and Lincoln's death mask filling the void between them. It's great to have it. We're further pursuing this chronological expansion through special exhibitions, and some of you may have seen or read about our fall 2015 unveiling of Thomas Hart Benton's spectacular 1930 America Today murals, which we displayed in the American Wing in our special exhibition galleries in the context of related period works. And actually, we had the Curry hanging at a real major sightline outside of this gallery. We recreated the space in which these murals displayed. They were commissioned by the New School for Social Research in the late 1920s and really chronicle, or they represent Benton's travels throughout America in the 1920s across the different regions. So had great resonance in the context of other historical American art in our wing. And just about 6 months ago, Patricia, I don't know if you've seen them since they've been reinstalled in the modern contemporary wing in a very kind of streamlined modern space with this beautiful black marble floor and have a very different feel, different period feel. But it was fabulous to have them, and we're just thrilled they're now a permanent part of the collection at the Met. So in the face of these updates and refreshments, I do feel it's important to emphasize that the American Wing's founding history is the first permanent installation in an art museum of American colonial and federal decorative arts and architectural fragments, has really indelibly shaped the department's collection development and character since its early 20th century founding. And I'm showing you a circa 1920 design for the proposed American Wing by the Columbia University-trained architect and urban planner Grosvenor Atterbury, and who is probably actually best known for his 1909 model housing community of Forest Hills, Queens, that was sponsored by the Russell Sage Foundation. But in 1980, the Wing inaugurated a new series of extensive galleries for 19th and early 20th century decorative arts, as well as American paintings and sculpture, which were collected actually from the time of the museum's founding in 1870, but the paintings and sculpture were not shown in the American Wing, they were shown in the European galleries, and so fewer of those works were on view. And these new galleries in a courtyard were enclosed actually in 1980, just 1980, in this very dramatic skylight design by Kevin Roche, John Diglew, and Associates, one that continues to be among the most visited public spaces in the Met. And we now have a cafe, which also draws more people to this courtyard, so that's always a good thing. And the American Wing's latest renovation and reinstallation, as I was saying earlier, it was also overseen by Roche, and it was completed in 2011, only the third in the Met's history, the American Wing's history. It provides certainly greater flexibility for telling varied stories with a multiplicity of objects. And we do this in both single gallery focus displays that rotate over the course of a year, and also in mid-size exhibitions that fill our Wolf Special Exhibition galleries, which is where the Benton murals first appeared. And the American Wing curators are keen to continue to experiment with different types of mixed media installations. For example, this is a chronological mashup of 19th century folk art and modernist painting, here represented by Charles Sheeler's appropriately titled work, Americana, which is another loan from the Modern Contemporary Department. But it's paired with this little vignette of Shaker material, early 19th century Shaker material, which of course Sheeler actually collected and depicts in his painting. And it's a great way for us to underline this really influential dialogue between folk art and modernism, because it was really the early 20th century modernists who in a sense rediscovered historical folk art and drawn to its emotional honesty, its aesthetic pleasures, and we're some of the leading collectors of the material as well. And then in fall of 2015, we displayed a number of little scene drawings from the late 1930s by the leading 20th century pioneer of so-called self-taught artists, that is Bill Traylor. And we displayed this in another gallery of 19th century folk art. Traylor, who was born into slavery outside of Montgomery, Alabama, documented the capital city's vibrant black community during the Depression years in more than 1,200 works. And this installation marked the first time that the Traylor drawings had ever been shown in the American Wing, and 20 years since they had last been seen anywhere in the museum. You might ask why we have work by the 1930s. Traylor was actually born in the 1850s, so sometimes that date works for us. It works to our advantage. Not always, but in this case, it certainly did. That's right. And I'm particularly committed to a greater inclusion of works on paper in our galleries, despite the need to show them at lower light levels due to their fragility and light sensitivity. For example, we've identified a self-contained alcove here off of one of our American Impressionist galleries, where we've been showing a series of Mary Cassatt's beautiful pastels and watercolors. And we rotate that about every 4 months. And we're lucky at the Met to have enough depth in that material that we can kind of keep these rotation going. But just so you can see her work in the context of paintings by other American Impressionists, both male and female. And we've recently installed kind of a more experimental focus gallery of works, including watercolors by Winslow Homer, looking at the artist's production across his career from his New York days through his late years in Maine, as the Met is really one of the few museums in this country that can tell that story, given the range of Homer's work, rich Homerful holdings. I've also reworked the Ashcan and 8 early modernism galleries, the space that currently closes our chronological survey in the American Wing, so we can periodically include etchings and pastels by artists like John Sloan and Everett Shin. And I've done this because I think in order to really understand the significance of these Ashcan artists, these urban realists, you really need to see their paintings in the context of their graphic work. And many of you may know they actually began their career as artists, reporters, as newspaper illustrators, sketch artists in Philadelphia, worked for many Philadelphia newspapers before relocating to New York around 1909. And currently in this gallery, we're actually featuring a George Bellows, one of his Tennis at Newport series, and then a Sloan painting, Gray and Brass, from a private collection. I'm also excited about 2 additions to our Colonial Portraiture gallery, which actually begins the chronological narrative if you come up in that elegant glass elevator from the ground floor. And that was adding a case of Boston silver, which, as many of you know, silver was far more valued than portraits in 18th century America. And an extremely rare portrait by the first documented enslaved African American working in the colonies, working in Massachusetts, an artist by the name of Prince Dama Barnes. And our curator of textiles, Amelia Peck, actually acquired this painting a few years ago while she was researching an exhibition on the 18th century international market for textiles. It was called Interwoven Globe, fantastic exhibition from about 2013. And she was drawn to this painting because of this banyan, this dressing gown that this Scottish merchant is wearing. Didn't know anything about the artist. The image was included in the exhibition in the catalog. It went on our website, and someone contacted her, the director of a small historical society in Massachusetts, in Hingham, Massachusetts, who said, "I know who that artist is. We own 2 portraits by this." And so inadvertently, we've been able to acquire some interesting works by African-American artists. And she wrote a great article on this for Antiques Magazine last January, if anyone wants more info. We've also opened 2 new gallery installations, kind of wholesale reinstallations of different galleries. We did this last summer, and they're still on view. I mentioned our curator of Latin American art, Rhonda Cassell, who's been in the wing for about 3 years now, who organized a very thoughtful look at the Met's collecting of colonial Mexican art throughout its history, or non-collecting of it, as the case may be. And also our textile and senior paintings curator collaborated on an installation of quilts and folk art, and we have an extraordinary collection of quilts. They're quite large. They take up a lot of wall space, so it's not something you see on a regular basis in the wing, but we're trying to make space for that as well. Now I'm going to give you just a little bit of history on the wing. The displays that feature this mix of decorative arts and paintings suggest a precedent that really was set with the historic 1909 Hudson Fulton exhibition, which was the Met's first foray in showcasing American art in its then special exhibition galleries. It was a landmark lone exhibition that was part of New York's commemoration of the 300th anniversary of Henry Hudson's exploration of the river that bears his name. And Robert DeForest, who served as the Met's president from 1913 to 1931, as well as the chair of the Celebrations Art Committee, later noted that the Hudson Fulton exhibition was not only intended to mark an important historical event, but to, quote, test out the question whether American domestic art was worthy of a place in an art museum. And the popularity of the exhibition, it was seen by nearly 300,000 visitors in just over 3 months, proved that it was indeed worthy of being seen, and the Met soon thereafter committed itself to building this collection of colonial and federal decorative arts, rather than focusing on the 19th century initially. That came a little bit later. The largest lender of furniture to the Hudson Fulton effort was the Connecticut businessman H. Eugene Bowles. His collection, which was later acquired by the philanthropist Mrs. Russell Sage and presented to the museum, formed the nucleus of the American Wing's early furniture holdings. And then another major lender to the Hudson Fulton show was especially work by the New York cabinet maker Duncan Phyfe, was Richard Townsley Haynes Halsey, who is pictured here in his spectacles. In 1913, when DeForest took up the presidency of the Met, this antiquarian collector, Halsey, was elected a trustee and was made the chairman of the Committee on American Decorative Arts, becoming, in effect, the first decorative arts curator at the Met, without the title. And he worked with DeForest and with Henry Kent, who was the secretary of the Board of Trustees, acquiring historical interiors and architectural elements from houses in New England, primarily New England and the Mid-Atlantic, with a brief dip into Virginia. And it was decided by this triumvirate that a period room approach, which was actually kind of a novel concept for American museums then, it was a German museological innovation, that would be the most appropriate setting for this early collection of furniture, which is why when you visit the Met today, we still have an entire floor of period rooms where a lot of other museums have gotten rid of them, have broken them up. In fact, Robert and Emily DeForest, who shared her husband's passion for collecting Americana, were the leading lights behind the 1924 establishment of the Met's American Wing, with Emily purchasing the museum's first period room to enter the collection from an 18th century home in Woodbury, Long Island, New York, which was christened the Hewlett Room after its first owner. The facade of Martin Thompson's Branch Bank of the United States, which was torn down at 15.5 Wall Street in 1915, was the next artifact to be pursued by the Met. And Robert DeForest, happily for us, had dual positions then. He was not only the president of the Met, but he was the president of New York City's Art Commission. So he ensured that the facade was saved and eventually formed the entrance to the new American Wing. And if you visit the American Wing today, that's the first thing you see when you walk into the courtyard. It actually is called the American Wing because it was a freestanding wing when we opened in 1924, and you actually could enter through Central Park. So that's why it's just been built up around it, of course. So from its opening in 1924, in the midst of this very popular Colonial Revival zeitgeist that was sweeping the country, the wing was a great favorite of the museum-going public, and its success was in no small measure, I would say, to the pervasive ancestor worship that practiced by much of the country's elite in those years. However, the founder's mission was fundamentally educational, broadly educational, if defined quite differently. For Halsey, the American Wing was a place for the acculturation of New York's immigrant classes, as he noted with conviction in a speech at the opening of the wing, and I quote, "Much of the America of today has lost sight of its traditions. The tremendous changes in the character of our nation and the influx of foreign ideas utterly at variance with those held by the men who gave us the Republic threaten and, unless checked, may shake the foundations of our Republic. A journey through this new American Wing cannot fail to bring with it a spirit of thankfulness that our great city at last has a setting for the traditions so dear to us and so invaluable to the Americanization of many of our people, to whom much of our history has been hidden in a fog of unenlightenment." So Halsey was definitely a man of his time, or perhaps anticipating a certain GOP candidate. But here are two images I wanted to show you of the wing's 17th and 18th century period rooms brought to life by costumed women who underlined this very theatrical nature that Halsey brought to his approach. And if you think about the historical interpreters of Colonial Williamsburg, a lot of this really started here at the Met in the American wing. DeForest, in contrast, adhered to an earlier 19th century belief in the relation of beauty, good design, and cultural and social reform that really derived from the Anglo-American aesthetic and arts and crafts movements. And this tenet had influenced the Met's founding mission in 1870, and that was to encourage and develop, quote, the study of the fine arts and the application of the arts to manufacture and practical life, which actually came out of a British model at the South Kensington Museum, now the Victoria and Albert Museum. The progressive philanthropist DeForest truly believed that the museum could help all visitors, children, and members of the working class to appreciate the beautiful and to utilize the beautiful on the practical side of earning their living. So they would come to the museum, look at extraordinary examples of good design, and take that back to whatever practice they were engaged in. So there were lace-making classes, a lace-making collection that many Italian immigrant women and children came to look at, and very interesting early history in terms of how the collections were formed. The DeForests were also committed to a more broadly defined American art. They were collecting Mexican pottery alongside Pennsylvania German Fraktur, and as well as works by their distant relative, Louis Comfort Tiffany. So an approach that, if it wasn't fully hemispheric in terms of how they defined American art, it was certainly ahead of its time. And it provides our Curator of Latin American Art with an interesting historical context in thinking about how we can tell that story now. These dual philosophies and approaches to the American past and ideas of Americanness and cultural nationalism continued to shape the character of the wing through the World War II years, leading the editor of the magazine Antiques to write in 1949 on the occasion of the department's 25th anniversary of both its influential legacy and potential expanded mission in terms that certainly still resonate for us today. And I won't take the time to read this to you. I hope you can read that clearly, but I love the last line where it talks about how the American wing might be expanded to cover the full 19th century and even the 20th. But right now, it's something to still building on their collections. And then speaking of important occasions, the upcoming 150th anniversary of the founding of the Met in 2020 and the centenary of the American wing in 2024 have all of the curators thinking about how we might mark our history and progress in creative ways, working collaboratively on ambitious mixed media projects. And one idea that has surfaced for the 150th is a look at the birth of the modern New York art world and its attendant cultural production from the Gilded Age through the Progressive era, in effect continuing the stories begun in earlier Met landmark exhibitions, for example, Art in the Empire City and In Pursuit of Beauty, Americans in the Aesthetic Movement. And a concept for the wing's 100th anniversary in 2024, to which I'm particularly partial, having developed as part of a curatorial team an ambitious project that was alas not realized before my departure at the VMFA, but it was an exhibition titled Making America, Memory, Myth, Identity, that was really meant to be a critical examination of this country's founding and most enduring cultural phenomenon, commonly known as the Colonial Revival. As the American wing is second only to Colonial Williamsburg as a highly influential and surviving early 20th century manifestation of this phenomenon, it seems like a very appropriate project for us and something we're starting to develop. As we conceived of it in Virginia, which would need to be retooled for the Met, the exhibition featured some 200 objects, painting, sculpture, works on paper, photography, decorative arts, architectural and landscape design, costume, popular culture ephemera, dating from the late 18th century to the present day. And what really distinguished this look at the Colonial Revival, which is generally, historically, has looked at something that's coming out of the Centennial Exhibition, 1876 in Philadelphia, but not something that began much earlier, and certainly not something that continues today. but it's really this broader understanding of the phenomenon that distinguishes this study, a broader chronological and also geographic definition. So not just looking at the Anglo-American story, but the Spanish, the French, the Dutch story that shaped the revival not only in the East, but also on the West Coast, as well as throughout the Mississippi Valley, that really underscores this phenomenon as a truly multicultural, diverse regional revival, something I think the DeForest would have applauded. We're also defining it as more than just a style or a movement, which was once viewed as certainly very nostalgic or retardataire, but we'd like to see it as something that draws inspiration from the historical past to understand the present through a creative use of iconic and hybrid forms. The exhibition would really explore why and how this desire to revisit the past and reinterpret has shaped America's visual landscapes, ideologies, and collective memories really in times of celebration and crisis. And Lisa and I were talking today about how the World's Fair, which is a specialization of hers, is such a great lens for looking at this moment from 1876 up to really the 1930s. And this slide just shows you a few of these resonant colonial objects from the Virginia Museum's collection, Augustus St. Gaudens' great patriarch, Puritan patriarch, as well as Wallace Nutting's update of a Windsor chair, the Century Vase, which was developed for the centennial, and then Thomas Hart Benton's dynamic Colonial Brides, a parable about trading women brides for tobacco in Jamestown, Virginia. And I'm happy to say the Met has different examples of variants of all of these objects. But 2020 and 24 are still some time away, so I wanted to tell you about our current exhibition offering, just in case any of you may be in New York in the next couple of months, and a few others coming up. First, Artistic Furniture of the Gilded Age, which is on view through early June, is a 3-part project that includes some of the most lavish objects made for New York's late 19th century elite during the so-called aesthetic age or the aesthetic movement. And the effort, really, the inspiration for the effort was to mark the awe-inspiring reveal of our latest period room in the wing, the Worsham Rockefeller dressing room, which dates to 1882, and it's installed and interpreted in this broader context of its designer, George Shasty, whose identity was really just fully uncovered and fully attributed to him in the course of doing research on this room. And then we're also showing some of his major competitors for this market in New York, Herder Brothers, you may be more familiar with, and particularly their commissions for the William H. Vanderbilt Fifth Avenue mansion. We happen to own a lot of the material from that house. So an interesting way to think contextually about a permanent collection object with loans and with taking a different focus on different aspects of our holdings. I also have particular affection for this project, not only because I wrote my dissertation on this period, the American Aesthetic Movement, but also because I had the pleasure of helping to acquire for the Virginia Museum another room from the Worsham Rockefeller townhouse on West 54th Street, which stood where MoMA's sculpture garden is now. And I'm showing you here the bedroom, which is now installed at the Virginia Museum alongside the stunning portrait by the French painter Alexander Cabanel of the enterprising Richmond Virginia native, Arabella Worsham, who ended up marrying into the Huntington family and did quite well, became one of the richest women in America, but had the extraordinary vision to create this really beautiful house. And we have a chair from Virginia that's also part of the exhibition. And one of the things we did in thinking about digital media in our galleries, we wanted to find a way to tell this remarkable woman's story. Very little is known about her. She kind of dissembled about her past over her lifetime. She actually ended up marrying a nephew, Henry Huntington, and if you know the Huntington Art Gallery in Pasadena, California, she was directly responsible for that museum, for buying the Gainsboroughs, so became a major European painting collector as well. But we commissioned an episode of something called the Memory Palace. Have any of you heard of this podcast? It's a really interesting podcast. I encourage you to take a listen to it or Google it sometime. It's produced by an LA-based writer, historian named Nate DeMeo, and it's just this wonderfully evocative story he tells not only about Arabella Worsham, but about the experience of the room. And he is actually going to be our next artist in residence at the Met. He'll be joining us this coming year and is focusing specifically on the American wing. So we have some other exciting projects we're going to be doing with him. And for those of you whose taste runs less to Victorian excess than to antebellum simplicity, I'm happy to share that the next offering in our special exhibition galleries, which opens this July, will feature highlights from our Shaker design collection. The exhibition illuminates furniture, textiles, other design by the craftsmen affiliated with the United Society of Believers, also known as the Shakers, which of course a utopian religious community that rose to prominence in the early 19th century. And we also hope to do some multimedia, bring some multimedia effects into this installation to really explore not only how this very streamlined, his early, very simple, streamlined craft and production influenced, well, certainly reflected their beliefs and communal beliefs and customs, but it also inspired this early generation of modernists, early 20th century modernists, someone like Charles Sheeler, who started collecting this material in the teens. We also will be showing a video projection of Martha Graham's Appalachian Spring, performed to Aaron Copland's, of course, beloved score, and paired with a chair by Isamu Noguchi from the 1955 stage production of the Appalachian Spring. So something that we hope will create more of a sensory experience for visitors. We do have a very beautiful Shaker period room, but the rest of the collection is really on view. Whereas most of these changing exhibitions in the American Wing take place in the Wolf Galleries, as of this spring, we're reclaiming a space at the end of our mezzanine level near the Luce Center for American Art for the display of artwork, specifically for showcasing some of our works on paper, which are harder to show throughout our galleries. The space had been converted to a little-used computer lab, and when I got there, I decided we really needed to show original artwork in it again. So in mid-May, we're opening an installation called Printing a Child's World, which is a collaboration between the American Wing and the Department of Drawings and Prints that highlights innovations in late 19th and early 20th century printing techniques and formats aimed at or featuring children. And the exhibition is really anchored by these two paintings in our collection, Seymour Joseph Guy's Story of Golden Locks and George Luke's Boy with Baseball. And one of the reasons we're doing this installation, some of you may have seen these collections, the so-called Burdick collection of baseball cards, which have gotten a lot of play at the Met. They were featured in, I think, a United Airline magazine a number of years ago. And it's really an extraordinary collection of baseball cards and other popular ephemera. And they're shown on one wall in this corridor and have never really been contextualized in any way. So we wanted to try to do an installation that would speak to some of those cards, but also talk about just printing and the collection of objects by children and featuring children. So we'll be showing some movable books, Randolph Caldicott's wonderful House of Jack Build, the original watercolors for that book, and a few other things, Willie Mays. And lest you think we're only developing smaller scale projects, in the winter of 2018, we'll be opening the first exhibition to situate the so-called father of the Hudson River School of Landscape Painting, Thomas Cole, in an international context, and that is an effort that will later travel to the National Gallery in London. We're going to be exploring the influence of European old masters on his work, as well as on some very important trips he took to London, where he looked at the work of J.M.W. Turner and John Constable, and how that really shaped his evolving vision of the American landscape, which was crystallized in the Met's iconic The Oxbow. So we really hope to complicate this notion of Cole's Americanness. Though he was English-born, he is really embraced as this father of an American national school. And I'm showing you The Oxbow along with an early sketch for the painting that we acquired recently. And in the spring of 2017, this is for Patricia, at the Met Breuer, my colleague and Patricia's, a fellow Marston Hartley scholar in the Modern Contemporary Department, Randy Griffey, will debut his greatly anticipated exhibition, Marston Hartley's Maine. And I love your Hartley Maine in the collection, just beautiful. I was just up there looking at it closely, taking a picture for Randy. So I trust I've whet your appetite for not only the Met's current offerings, but for opportunities to return to the American Wing, where I hope you will always see something fresh and different. channeling Holland Cotter's call to arms for American collections. This new era of growth and change at the Met is certainly a work in progress, but one I hope will prove worthwhile and engaging for all. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming to the talk. Thank you. I've kept you a long time with those two performance pieces, but I'm happy to answer any questions if there's time. Anyone has a question? Yes?
You showed at least one piece of, well, the toddler who, with the 40-year-old eye.
Right.
Was painted by a black person.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know anything about the relationship of a professional black artist?
We actually do. We know a lot about Joshua Johnson that's come out in the last, I'd say, 20 or 30 years. I mean, he was born into slavery. He was manumitted when he was 19. We think he had a white father, African-American mother. He's an interesting painter in terms of a folk painter because he wasn't a limner. He didn't travel around. He was based in Baltimore. He's one of the few painters from that period who actually was resident in a city and had a very successful career for a period of time in that city. He lived in the Fells Point area of Baltimore, down by the harbor, where the big harbor is today. And most of the neighbors in that area were ship captains, a lot of abolitionists, a lot of Quakers. So he actually had a very successful career for a period of time. His career fell off in about the late 1820s, 30s, around the time that there were much more restrictive kind of racial laws instituted in Baltimore, and their movements were restricted much more. And we don't really know what happened to him. I think a death date was finally determined, but most of his career was from about 1805 to about 1815, and we know about 100 works. He only signed one painting. It's in the collection of the National Gallery. And we only know of 2 paintings of black sitters that he ever did to ministers from Baltimore who were very active in the Anti-Slavery League. But a very interesting character. And as I said, that most of his work was, we knew the name. There was someone at the Maryland Historical Society who did the most research on him, and by using connoisseurship skills, could see a similarity of technique and hand and style. And at the beginning, no one really knew that he was African American. And then there was an ad that he took out in a Baltimore paper that he said, "I am a free artist of color, a self-taught genius." And that's how he was advertising his wares, and it worked. He had a pretty strong patron base for a while. But the papers, I think the manumission papers weren't found till the 1980s. So there's still a lot of work to do. I'd love to learn more about Emma von Name, and I'm not sure I can go back to the painting, but one of the most wonderful aspects of that painting, I'm sure you notice, is that surreally scaled crystal goblet next to the young girl overflowing with wild strawberries, which were a symbol of Christian goodness and purity. And there have been a lot of different readings of what is that? Why is it that size? And some scholars have proposed, well, her parents were glass manufacturers. Well, there wasn't a lot of glass being produced in Baltimore in those years. We know that doesn't work. I mean, I think he was really just pulling out of the straws all of the stops and showing how he could paint something that was very difficult for academic artists to paint, light going through glass, reflecting through glass, and just a very whimsical, imaginative presentation. He understood perspective. There are a lot of other paintings where they seem the figure is more comfortably placed within an interior, within a space. It's probably one of the most imaginative and masterful paintings he did, but we'd love to learn more about that family, and there hasn't been much that's come up in kind of city records. But he, I think 70% of his oeuvre are of children. And he painted, children with their mothers. If you notice that wonderful coral jewelry that you see in so many folk paintings that were the protective, warding off ill health. But he really pulled out all the stops in that one. Yeah, it's a great painting. We love it. We really love it. Well, thank you all for coming. And it's a pleasure to be in Wichita. Thank you.
Wonderful. Expansive, fresh vision coming to the Metropolitan. It's fun here in Wichita to understand the roots of change that are happening in New York. And I want to invite you back. I want to invite you back to this room at exactly this time next week, when the chief curator of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum will be here for the Howard Wooden lecture, talking about Georgia O'Keeffe, of course. And I want to invite the queen of the Murdock Society, Toni Gates, to the stage to tell us something about dinner this evening and an event coming up, our spring party coming up right around the corner. So Toni, come chat.